The dust of redemption, Wyoming, was a fine, mean powder that got into your clothes and your soul. It was a town built on judgment, a place where folks measured your worth by the straightness of your spine and the silence of your sins. For a girl like Leah, arriving on the noon stage with nothing but a worn carpet bag and a secret swelling under her simple wool dress, redemption was not a destination. It was a sentence. The town saw her before she even stepped down. They saw the shame she tried to hide, the fear in her eyes. Whispers started in the general store, slithered across the street to the saloon, and coiled in the pews of the church long before she found a room to rent. She was a fallen woman, a stain. And from the porch of the land office, Elara Vance watched it all. The town's matriarch, a ranch widow who owned half the valley, and a silence as vast as the Wyoming sky. Her husband had been gone 5 years, a hunting accident they'd called it, and since then, Elara had become a creature of observation, her face a mask of stone. She saw the girl, saw the whispers, saw the doors of redemption closing one by one. Elara Vance said nothing. She just watched, and that silence was the loudest judgment of all. The shaming came on a Sunday. It was a cold, bright morning, the kind that makes every sin feel sharp and exposed. Leah had nowhere else to go, so she went to church, hoping for a moment of peace, a whisper of grace. She was a fool to hope. When she slipped into a back pew, a wave of silence rolled through the congregation, necks craned, eyes hard as river stones fixed on her. The preacher, Reverend Miller, paused mid-sermon, his gaze landing on Leah like a physical blow. He didn't need to say her name. His sermon shifted, his voice rising with righteous fire, speaking of serpents in the garden, of temptation and moral decay that could poison a godly community from within. Every word was a stone thrown at her. Leah shrank into herself, her face burning, her hands clutching her belly, as if to protect the innocent life within from their hatred. Women pulled their children closer. Men stared with a mixture of contempt and a dark, hungry curiosity. She was an island in a sea of judgment, alone, utterly alone. Then the main doors of the church creaked open. Elara Vance stood in the doorway, framed by the bright morning sun. She wore black, as she always did, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. The room fell into a deeper silence, a silence of respect and fear. Elara owned the bank, the water rights, and the mortgages on half the homes in this town. Her presence was a weight no one could ignore. She surveyed the scene, the preacher at his pulpit, the congregation in their pews, and the small, trembling girl in the back. Her eyes, the color of a winter storm, missed nothing. She should have turned away. She should have taken a seat at the front, adding her silent condemnation to the rest. But she didn't. Instead, Elara Vance began to walk down the long aisle. Her boots made no sound on the wooden floorboards. Every eye followed her. She walked past the front pews, past the middle rows, all the way to the back. She stopped at Leah's pew. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then Elara Vance turned, smoothed her black dress, and sat down right beside the fallen girl. The shock was a physical thing, a gasp of air sucked from the room. She didn't look at Leah. She didn't speak. She just sat, her back straight as a rifle barrel, and stared directly at the preacher. The message was unmistakable. It was a challenge, an act of defiance that would shatter the fragile peace of redemption, Wyoming, forever. Reverend Miller faltered. The fire in his voice sputtered and died, replaced by a nervous stammer. He lost his place in his sermon, his eyes darting from Elara to the stunned faces of his flock. He knew what he was seeing. It wasn't an act of charity. It was a declaration of war. The service ended in a fluster of confusion and hurried whispers. No one dared to approach Elara or the girl beside her. They parted like a river around a rock as Elara stood, her hand resting for just a moment on Leah's shoulder. "Come with me," she said, her voice low and steady. It wasn't a request. Leah could only nod, her mind reeling. She followed Elara out of the church and into the cold sunlight, the stares of the entire town burning into her back. Elara's wagon was waiting, a sturdy buckboard hitched to two strong horses. "Get in," Elara commanded. As they rode out of town, Leaving the whispers and the judgment behind them, Leah finally found her voice. Why? She asked, the word barely a whisper. Why did you do that? Elara kept her eyes on the road ahead, her profile as sharp and unforgiving as the mountains on the horizon. Because I know a thing or two about being judged by hypocrites, she said. Her tone was flat, offering no further explanation. The Vance Ranch was a kingdom, a sprawling valley of rich pasture land and thick timber held in the cradle of the mountains. The house was a fortress of log and stone, built to withstand the worst of Wyoming winters and the worst of men. It was a place of wealth and power, but as they pulled into the yard, Leah could feel a profound loneliness clinging to it like morning mist. It was a house without a heart. Elara led her inside. The main room was vast, dominated by a stone fireplace big enough to roast an ox. The furniture was heavy, dark wood. The walls were covered in the mounted heads of deer and elk, their glass eyes staring down with a permanent, dead surprise. This was a man's world, her husband's world, and it felt like he had only just stepped out. You can have the room at the top of the stairs, Elara said, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. It was my son's. The words hung in the air. Leah hadn't known Elara had a son. No one in town ever spoke of him. He's gone? Leah asked hesitantly. He's gone, Elara confirmed, her face giving away nothing. The room has been empty for a long time. It's time someone lived in it again. That night, Leah lay in a soft bed for the first time in months, the clean sheets smelling of lavender and cedar. But sleep wouldn't come. She could hear Elara moving around downstairs, the lonely sound of a single pair of boots on the wooden floors. Why was this powerful woman helping her? What ghosts haunted this silent, grieving house? Leah clutched the small, worn locket around her neck, a secret she had carried for 1,000 miles. She had thought her past was the most dangerous thing in her life. But as the old house groaned around her, she had the chilling feeling that she hadn't escaped her own story. She had just walked into someone else's. The days at the Vance Ranch fell into a quiet rhythm. Elara was a demanding but fair taskmaster. There was work to be done, and she expected Leah to earn her keep. They mucked stalls, mended fences, and tended to the small herd of cattle that was Elara's legacy. Leah, who had only ever known the close, stifling streets of a city, found a strange comfort in the hard physical labor. It quieted the fear in her mind. Her body, already strong, grew harder. Her hands, once soft, became calloused. Elara taught her things. How to read the sky for weather, how to track a wounded animal, how to fire the heavy Winchester her husband had left behind. A woman alone needs to know how to protect herself, Elara said one afternoon, as Leah learned to load and aim the rifle. The world is not a kind place. I know, Leah had replied quietly. But Elara was not just teaching her to be a ranch hand. She was teaching her to be a survivor. There was an urgency to the lessons, a grim purpose that went beyond simple self-sufficiency. It felt like she was preparing Leah for a war. The town did not forget. Reverend Miller made it his personal crusade to save Elara Vance's soul. He would ride out to the ranch once a week, his Bible in his hand, and deliver sermons from the front gate, warning Elara of the damnation that awaited those who harbored sin. Elara would just watch him from the porch, a cup of coffee in her hand, her face unreadable, until he finally gave up and rode away. But the preacher's words were having an effect. Elara's ranch hands, men who had worked for her husband for years, started to quit. They were good men, but they had families in town. They couldn't afford to be on the wrong side of the community's moral crusade. Let them go, Elara said when the last one had gone. We'll manage on our own. And they did. The two of them, a widow and a girl with a secret, ran a 1,000-acre ranch by themselves. The work was brutal, from sunup to sundown, but in their shared struggle, a strange bond began to form. It wasn't friendship, not yet. It was the quiet, unspoken respect of two soldiers in the same trench. One evening, as they sat by the fire, exhausted, Elara finally spoke of her husband. Robert was a good man, she said, her eyes on the flames. A strong man. He built this place from nothing, but he was too trusting. He believed in the good of people, even when they showed him their worst. She looked at Leah, her gaze sharp. He was investigating something before he died, some business about the railroad trying to buy up land. He thought something wasn't right. And the hunting accident? Leah asked softly. Alara's face hardened. There were two sets of tracks leading away from where they found his body, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. The sheriff said the second set was from the man who found him. I never believed it. She had said too much. The walls went back up. The moment of connection was over. But Leah had seen behind the mask. She saw a woman consumed by a grief that was tangled up with suspicion. A few days later, a letter arrived. It was addressed to Leah, care of the Redemption General Store. Ilara handed it to her without a word. Leah's hands shook as she opened it. The handwriting was elegant, but the words were a threat. I know where you are. I will come for what is mine. You cannot hide from me forever. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. Who is it from? Ilara asked, her voice sharp. Leah couldn't speak. She just handed the letter to Ilara. The widow read it, her face grim. It seems your past has found you, Ilara said, and it's bringing trouble to my door. She looked at Leah, at her swelling belly, and then at the letter. Perhaps it's time you told me the whole truth. Leah finally told her everything. She sat at the heavy oak table in the ranch house kitchen, the unsigned letter lying between them like a coiled snake, and the story poured out of her. Her name wasn't just Leah, it was Leah Caldwell. Her father was a senator back in Boston, a man whose power was exceeded only by his cruelty. She had been his prized possession, a beautiful daughter to be married off for political gain. The man he'd chosen for her was named Marcus Thorne, the heir to a railroad fortune, a man with a charming smile and eyes as cold as a winter grave. I was a business transaction, Leah said, her voice hollow. A merger of two powerful families. The night of their engagement party, Marcus had celebrated with too much champagne. He'd followed her out to the gardens. He'd been forceful, unforgiving. He had taken what he believed was already his. I tried to tell my father, she whispered, the shame of it still a fresh wound. He told me I was hysterical. He said a woman's duty was to please her husband and that I should be grateful for the match. 2 months later, she discovered she was pregnant. She knew with a sickening certainty that if she married Marcus, the child would be his weapon, a chain to bind her to him forever. So she ran. She stole what money she could and bought a train ticket west, to a place she hoped he would never find her. Redemption, Wyoming, she said with a bitter laugh. It seemed fitting. Ilara listened without interruption, her face a mask of stone. When Leah was finished, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a slow, relentless counting of seconds. So the father of your child, Ilara said finally, her voice carefully neutral, is the son of a railroad baron, and your own father is a United States senator. Yes, Leah whispered, and they are looking for you. Yes. Ilara stood and walked to the fireplace, her back to Leah. She stared up at the portrait of her late husband that hung above the mantel. A handsome man with kind eyes and a confident smile. The railroad, Ilara said, more to herself than to Leah. Robert was looking into their land deals. He said they were using threats and intimidation to force ranchers to sell cheap. He was gathering evidence to take to the territorial government. She turned to face Leah, her eyes burning with a new terrible light. His hunting accident happened 2 days before he was scheduled to meet with the governor. The pieces clicked into place, sharp and brutal. You think they're connected, Leah breathed. Your husband's death, and the man I'm running from. I think, Ilara said, her voice like ice, that your fiancé's family has a history of getting what they want, no matter who gets in their way. The silence that followed was dense with implications. This was no longer just about a shamed girl and a lonely widow. This was about murder and power and a conspiracy that reached from the halls of Washington to the rugged mountains of Wyoming. Leah's secret hadn't just brought trouble to Ilara's door. It had brought the answer to a 5-year-old mystery. It had brought her husband's killer back into her life. Suddenly, from outside came the sound of a horse approaching, fast. Both women froze. Ilara moved to the window, her hand going to the Winchester that was always propped beside the door. A lone rider was galloping into the yard. It was the sheriff. and he was riding like the devil himself was on his tail. Sheriff Brody slid off his horse before it had even stopped, his face pale and slick with sweat. He was a good man, but he was not a brave one, and he looked terrified. "Ilara," he panted, stumbling up the porch steps. "You've got to get her out of here, now." "What are you talking about, Brody?" Ilara demanded, her rifle still held at the ready. "A telegraph came through an hour ago, from Cheyenne, a private detective agency, Pinkertons. They're on their way here. They have a federal warrant." He looked at Leah, his eyes wide with a fear that was not for himself. "A warrant for your arrest, miss, on charges of theft and moral vagrancy." "Moral vagrancy?" Ilara's voice was dripping with contempt. "That's not even a real crime. It is when a senator from Massachusetts pulls strings with the Department of Justice," the sheriff said grimly. "They're not coming to talk, Ilara. They're coming to take her back, and they're authorized to use any force necessary." Leah felt the floor tilt. The Pinkertons, hired manhunters with no conscience and the full backing of the law. They were the private army of the rich and powerful. "How much time do we have?" Ilara asked, her mind already working, calculating. "An hour, maybe two if they stop for a drink in town," Brody said. "I shouldn't even be here. If they find out I warned you—" "You did the right thing, Sheriff," Ilara said, her tone softening for a moment. "My husband always said you were a decent man." The sheriff just shook his head. "Robert was a better man than any of us. He wouldn't have stood for this." He looked from Ilara to Leah. "Get her out the North Trail. It's rough country, but it'll take you up into the high passes. They won't follow you there in the dark." He turned to leave. "Good luck, Ilara. You're going to need it." As the sheriff galloped away, Ilara turned to Leah. The time for quiet observation was over. The time for action had come. "Pack a bag," she commanded. "Food, warm clothes, ammunition, everything we can carry on 2 horses. "We?" Leah asked, stunned. "You're coming with me." "This is my fight now, too," Ilara said, her jaw set. "They didn't just come for you, Leah. They came for the truth about what happened to my husband. And I'll be damned if I let them bury it with him." They worked with a frantic, desperate energy. Ilara moved through the house, gathering supplies with the efficiency of a seasoned campaigner. She knew exactly what they would need to survive in the high country. Leah, her hands shaking, packed her own small bag. She tucked the unsigned letter inside, along with the locket her mother had given her. It was all she had left of her old life, and her new one. As she worked, her eyes fell on the room at the end of the hall. Her son's room, Ilar had called it. The door was always closed. In all the weeks she had been here, she had never seen it open. On a sudden impulse, she turned the knob. It was unlocked. The room was not what she expected. It wasn't a child's room. It was a study, a man's study, Robert Vance's study. A large desk sat against one wall, covered in maps and papers. Bookshelves lined the other walls, filled with books on law, geology, and engineering. This was the room of a man with a sharp and curious mind. And on the desk, held down by a rock that looked like a lump of raw silver, was a half-finished letter. Leah's breath caught in her throat. The letter was addressed to the territorial governor, and it was in Robert Vance's handwriting. "And therefore I have conclusive proof," she read, her heart hammering in her chest, "that the Wyoming Pacific Railroad, under the direction of Marcus Thorne's family, has engaged in a systematic campaign of fraud and intimidation to acquire land." She couldn't read anymore. She heard Ilara calling her name from downstairs. She folded the letter, her hands trembling, and tucked it into her dress. This was it. This was the evidence Robert Vance had been gathering. The reason he had been killed. And the reason Marcus Thorne would stop at nothing to get her back. It wasn't just about a runaway fiancé and an unwanted child. It was about a secret that could destroy an entire railroad empire. They rode north into the dying light, 2 women against the vast, unforgiving wilderness. They pushed their horses hard, the cold air burning in their lungs. Behind them, the lights of the Vance Ranch grew smaller and smaller, until they were just a memory. They rode for hours, the trail climbing steadily into the high country. The air grew thinner, colder. The silence of the mountains pressed in around them, a silence that was both a comfort and a threat. "We'll rest here," Ilara said. finally pulling her horse to a stop in a small sheltered basin. They were high above the valley now, in a world of rock and wind and stars. They built a small, smokeless fire and huddled around it for warmth, chewing on dried beef and hard biscuits. He was going to expose them, Leah said, her voice quiet in the vast darkness. She handed the letter to Alara. I found this in his study. Ilara read the letter by the faint firelight, her face unreadable. When she was done, she folded it carefully and looked at Leah. So this is what he died for, she said. It wasn't a question. This is the proof. They'll never stop looking for us now, Leah said. Not as long as we have this. No, Ilara agreed. They won't. She stared into the fire, her thoughts 1,000 miles away. He had a son, she said suddenly, her voice so soft Leah had to lean in to hear. Our son. His name was Daniel. He was 7 years old. The story came out in broken pieces, a confession torn from a place of deep, old pain. Daniel had been a bright, curious boy. The light of their lives, he had gotten sick. A fever that came on fast and burned hot. They had sent for the doctor in town, but a sudden storm had made the roads impassable. He died in my arms, Alara whispered, the words like ghosts in the cold night air. Robert, he never forgave himself. He thought if he'd been a richer man, a more powerful man, he could have saved him. That's when he started fighting the railroad. It wasn't about the money, it was about power. It was about proving he could protect his family. The grief was a raw, living thing in the small circle of firelight. Leah reached out and took Alara's hand. For the first time, she saw the woman behind the iron mask, a mother who had lost her child, a wife who had lost her husband, a woman who was just as alone in the world as she was. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond the fire. Both women froze. Alara was on her feet in an instant, the Winchester in her hands. Who's there? She called out, her voice sharp as steel. Silence. Then a figure stepped into the light. It was a man dressed in buckskins, his face hidden in the shadows of a wide-brimmed hat. He was not one of the Pinkertons. He was someone else entirely, and the rifle he held was aimed directly at Alara's heart. Evening, ladies, the stranger said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Didn't mean to startle you. Just following a trail. What trail? Ilara demanded, her own rifle unwavering. The man took another step into the light. He was older, his face a roadmap of hard miles, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. The trail of two women who seemed to have gotten themselves crosswise with some very powerful people. He nodded toward the south, back the way they had come. There's a half-dozen Pinkertons and a U.S. Marshal tearing up that valley looking for you. Figured you could use a friend. We don't know you, Leah said, her voice trembling. No, ma'am, you don't, the man agreed. But I knew Robert Vance. My name is Silas. Robert and we were working together. The name meant nothing to Leah, but she saw a flicker of recognition in Alara's eyes. Silas? The trapper? Alara asked. Robert mentioned you. Said you were the only man in these mountains he trusted. He was a good man, Silas said, finally lowering his rifle. Stood up for what was right, a rare thing these days. He looked from Alara to Leah. He told me he was close to getting the proof he needed against the railroad. Told me if anything happened to him, I should look for a letter. He looked at the piece of paper still in Alara's hand. I reckon that's it. They killed him for it, Alara said, her voice flat. I know, Silas said grimly, and they'll kill you for it too, which is why we need to get you out of this territory. And I know just the place. He told them of a hidden valley, a sanctuary deep in the mountains known only to a few old trappers, a place the law would never find. It's a hard ride in, he warned, especially with winter setting in, but it's your only chance. A sliver of hope, fragile but real, began to dawn. They had an ally, a friend of Robert's, a man who knew these mountains as well as Alara did. We'll need supplies, Alara said, her mind already shifting to the practicalities of the journey. Our pack mules. I know, Silas said. I found them. They're safe, hidden in a box canyon a few miles from here. We can retrieve them at first light. He looked at Leah, his gaze softening for the first time. You best get some rest, ma'am. You're going to need your strength. As Silas took the first watch, Leah and Alara huddled together under their blankets. For the first time in a long time, Leah felt a flicker of something that wasn't fear. It felt like hope. But as she drifted off to sleep, a new, unsettling thought crept into her mind. How had Silas known where to find them? How had he known about the letter? And why had a man who supposedly lived a life of solitude decided to get involved in their fight now? The journey to the hidden valley was a brutal test of endurance. For 5 days, they rode through a landscape of breathtaking beauty and unforgiving danger. Silas led them through high passes and down treacherous switchbacks, his knowledge of the mountains a constant, quiet reassurance. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He showed them how to find food where there seemed to be none, how to make a shelter that would hold against the wind, how to move through the wilderness without leaving a trace. Ilara and Silas worked together with the easy rapport of two people who understood the language of the wild. A silent partnership formed between them, built on a shared respect for the mountains and for the man they had both lost. Leah watched them, and she learned. She learned to be quiet, to be patient, to be aware of every sound and every shadow. The city girl was being stripped away, layer by layer, revealing a core of strength she never knew she possessed. Her pregnancy, which she had feared would be a weakness, became a source of fierce, protective power. She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her child. On the sixth day, they arrived. The entrance to the valley was a narrow crack in a sheer rock wall, almost invisible until you were right upon it. They led their horses through the passage, and the world opened up. It was a sanctuary, a perfect hidden bowl of green grass and tall pines, fed by a crystal-clear river. A small, sturdy cabin stood in a grove of aspens, a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. "Who lives there?" Leah asked, her voice hushed with awe. "Friends," Silas said. An older woman emerged from the cabin as they approached. She was Native American, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her long gray hair in two neat braids. She moved with a quiet dignity, her eyes calm and welcoming. "Silas," she said, her voice warm, "you brought company." "Morning Star," Silas replied, a smile touching his lips for the first time. "This is Alara Vance and Leah Caldwell. They're in some trouble. Need a place to stay for the winter." Morning Star's gaze fell on Leah's belly, and her smile widened. "The world is always in trouble," she said, "but new life is always a blessing. You are welcome here." The cabin was warm and clean, the air filled with the scent of herbs and wood smoke. Another man was inside, older than Silas, his face as weathered as the mountains themselves. He introduced himself as Bear. He and Morning Star were the valley's only other residents. They were a family of the wilderness, bound not by blood, but by a shared love for a life lived far from the noise and the judgment of the world. For the first time in a long time, Leah felt safe. The weeks that followed were a time of healing. Morning Star was a gifted healer, her knowledge of plants and remedies far surpassing any doctor Leah had ever known. She made teas for Leah that soothed her morning sickness and salves that eased the ache in her back. Bear taught Alara how to tan hides the old way, and the two of them would sit for hours, working in a comfortable silence. Silas became a quiet guardian, always watchful, always aware. He would disappear for days at a time, scouting the trails, making sure their sanctuary remained undiscovered. One evening, as the first snow of winter began to fall, Leah went into labor. It was nothing like the frantic, terrified birth she had imagined. Morning Star was there, her calm presence a steady anchor in the storm of pain. Ilara was there, holding her hand, her voice a constant murmur of encouragement. Her son was born just after midnight, a healthy, beautiful boy with a shock of dark hair in his mother's determined spirit. She named him Robert, after the man who had died fighting for the truth. As she held her son in her arms, looking at the faces of the strange, wonderful families she had found in this hidden corner of the world, Leah felt a peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. The past was still there. The threat of Marcus Thorne and her father was not gone. But in this moment, with her son safe in her arms, the future felt like a promise, not a threat. But there was still one piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. One night, as Silas was preparing to leave on another scouting trip, Leah finally found the courage to ask him the question that had been nagging at her. Silas, she said as he checked his rifle, that first night you found us. How did you know where to look? How did you know about the letter? Silas stopped what he was doing. He looked at her, his face unreadable in the firelight. Robert told me, he said simply. Robert was already dead, Leah said, confused. He left me a letter of his own, Silas explained, with a map and instructions. He said if anything happened to him, I was to find his wife. He said she would have the final piece of the puzzle. He paused. He said I was to protect you both, no matter the cost. The loyalty of it, the forethought, it was staggering. Robert Vance had been planning for his own death. But there's something else, Silas said, his voice dropping. Something Robert didn't know. Something I only just pieced together. He looked at Leah, his eyes full of a strange, sad light. The man you're running from, he said. Marcus Thorne. I've seen him before, years ago. He was part of a survey crew for the railroad, mapping these mountains. He took a deep breath. And he wasn't alone. The man he was with, the one giving the orders, it was your father, Senator Caldwell. The revelation was a physical blow. Her father, here, in these mountains. But that's not all, Silas said, his voice grim. The day Robert Vance died, they were here. I saw them, riding away from the direction of his hunting camp. I didn't think anything of it at the time. But now, the truth was a cold, ugly thing. Her father hadn't just been a cruel and distant man. He hadn't just sent men to bring her back. He was a murderer. He had been here. He had killed Robert Vance to protect his business interests. And he had let his own daughter run straight into the arms of the woman whose husband he had murdered. The winter in the Hidden Valley was a cocoon of peace. Leah's son, Robbie, grew strong and healthy. Elora seemed to shed years, the hard lines of grief on her face softening into something that looked like contentment. They were a family, forged in the crucible of shared danger. But as the snows began to melt, a shadow returned. The world outside had not forgotten them. Silas came back from a scouting trip with grim news. They're still looking, he said, his face etched with worry. The Pinkertons haven't given up, and they've got a new man leading them, a tracker, a man named Cutler. They say he can track a ghost across Bear Rock. The fear, which had been dormant for months, coiled in Leah's stomach again. And there's more, Silas said, his eyes on Alara. They've reopened the investigation into Robert's death, but they're not calling it a murder. They're calling you a person of interest. Me? Alara was stunned. They're spinning a story in town, Silas explained, that you were having an affair, that you and your lover killed Robert to get the ranch. My lover? Alara's voice was incredulous. Me, Silas said, his face grim. They're trying to discredit us, to turn this into a story of a jealous wife and a backwoods trapper. It's a lie, but it's a lie people will believe. The poison of her father's influence reached even here, into their sanctuary. We can't hide forever, Alara said, her voice hard as steel. Running was a tactic, not a solution. It's time to fight back. How? Leah asked. They have the law on their side. They have the money. They have the power. We have the truth, Alara said, and we have this. She touched the folded letter from her husband, which she now carried with her at all times. This is our weapon. Their plan was desperate, a long shot. They would go to Cheyenne, the territorial capital. They would go straight to the governor, a man Robert had spoken of as being honest. They would present him with the evidence and tell him the whole story. It's too dangerous, Silas argued. Cutler will be watching the trails. They'll catch you before you get within 100 miles of Cheyenne. Then we won't take the trails, Alara said, a familiar, calculating light in her eyes. We'll take the river. The journey down the river was a nightmare. They built a raft, a clumsy, heavy thing that was a constant struggle to control in the fast, cold water of the spring melt. They traveled at night, hiding during the day, their muscles aching, their bodies bruised and scraped. On the third night, they saw the campfires. Cutler and his men were on their trail, moving faster than they had anticipated. They had a tracker who could read the land as well as Silas. We have to split up, Silas said as they huddled in the darkness. It's our only chance. Alara, you and Leah take the raft. Continue downriver. Bear and I will lead them on a false trail into the Badlands. It'll buy you a day, maybe two. No, Ilara said. We stay together. There's no time to argue, Silas insisted. The evidence is what matters. Get it to the governor. He looked at Leah, at the baby sleeping in her arms. Protect them, he said to Ilara. It's what Robert would have wanted. Before they could argue further, he and Bear were gone, melting into the darkness like ghosts. The next 2 days were a blur of fear and exhaustion. Leah and Ilara poled the raft downriver, their eyes constantly scanning the banks. The baby was their compass, his needs a constant reminder of what they were fighting for. They were just outside of Cheyenne, the lights of the city a faint glow on the horizon, when Cutler finally caught up with them. They came out of the darkness, 4 of them, their boats moving with a silent, deadly efficiency. The lead boat was commanded by a man with eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. Cutler. Nowhere left to run, ladies, he called, his voice calm, almost conversational. Ilara raised her Winchester, but a shot from Cutler's boat splintered the stock of her rifle, knocking it from her hands. They were surrounded, trapped. The letter, Cutler said as his men boarded their raft. Give it to me, and I might let the boy live. Leah clutched Robbie to her chest. Ilara stood protectively in front of them, a shield against the inevitable. You'll have to kill us first, Ilara said, her voice unwavering. Cutler smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. That can be arranged. He raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Ilara's head. And then, from the darkness of the riverbank, another shot rang out. Not from a rifle, but from a heavy-caliber revolver. Cutler grunted, his hand flying to his shoulder, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. His men whirled, firing blindly into the darkness. Federal marshals! A voice boomed from the shore. Drop your weapons! Figures emerged from the trees, their badges glinting in the moonlight. 6 of them, armed and ready. Cutler, his face a mask of disbelief, made a decision. He lunged for Leah, trying to take the baby as a hostage. But Ilara was faster. She threw herself in front of Leah, taking the force of his body. They went down together, a tangle of limbs. Leah saw Cutler's hand, a knife appearing in it, as if by magic. He raised it to strike. And then another figure was there. Silas. He had appeared from nowhere, his own knife in his hand. He hadn't led them on a false trail. He had followed. He had been their guardian angel all along. The fight was short and brutal. When it was over, Cutler lay on the deck of the raft, his own knife in his chest, and Silas was bleeding from a wound in his side. The man who stepped forward from the group of marshals was older, his face grim. Ma'am, he said to Ilara as he helped her to her feet, it seems you've had a busy night. You have no idea, Ilara replied, her eyes on Silas, who was being tended to by one of the other marshals. The marshal looked at the letter in Leah's hand. Is that what I think it is? It's everything, Leah said. The trial was a sensation. It exposed a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of power. Senator Caldwell was ruined, his career ending in disgrace. The Thorn Railroad empire crumbled under the weight of federal investigations and public outrage. Justice, it turned out, was a slow, grinding thing. But sometimes it got there in the end. Silas survived. The knife wound was serious, but Morningstar's remedies and his own stubborn resilience saw him through. They returned to the Hidden Valley not as fugitives, but as heroes. The town of Redemption, humbled and shamed by the truth, sent a delegation to apologize. Reverend Miller was gone, replaced by a younger man who spoke of forgiveness instead of damnation. Ilara Vance, the silent widow, became a legend, a woman who had taken on a corrupt system and won. But she had no interest in legends. She had what she wanted. She had her husband's good name restored. She had justice. And she had a family. One evening, a year later, she sat on the porch of the cabin in the Hidden Valley, watching Leah rock her grandson to sleep. Silas sat beside her, his hand resting comfortably on hers. The world outside was still a complicated, dangerous place. But here, in this small pocket of wilderness, they had found their peace. They were no longer defined by the sins of others or by the judgment of a town that didn't understand. They were defined by the choices they had made, by the family they had built, by the love that had seen them through the darkest of nights. Ilara looked at Leah and at the child who carried her husband's name, and she knew that Robert would be proud. If you enjoyed this story of how two women fought for justice and found family in the most unexpected of places, please let us know in the comments. We love hearing from you. And for more stories of courage and the unbreakable bonds of the human heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what we have in store for you next.